March 15th, 1945, 7:30 hours. Railway station, Somerset, England. Obergefreiter Karl Hoffmann stepped from the truck into morning mist that made the English countryside look like something from a painting. Rolling hills, stone walls dividing fields, hedgerows still bare from winter, but showing hints of spring green. Around him, 23 other German prisoners shuffled into loose formation, all of them exhausted from the journey from their POW camp in Yorkshire, all of them uncertain about what came next. The propaganda had been explicit about British treatment of prisoners, but Karl's 18 months in British captivity had systematically contradicted every warning. Still, this was different. They were being sent to work on farms, living among British civilians rather than behind barbed wire. The other prisoners whispered nervously in German, "What if the locals attack us? What if they refuse to work with us? What if this is where the real punishment begins?" A British corporal, middle-aged, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his war doing unglamorous but necessary work, approached with a clipboard. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German. "Right then, you lot are being assigned to farms in the district. You'll work 8 hours daily, 6 days a week. Agricultural labor, planting, harvesting, maintenance, whatever the farmer requires. You'll be supervised but treated fairly. Work hard, behave properly, and you'll get on fine. Cause trouble, and you'll be back at the camp facing disciplinary action." Questions? No one spoke. The corporal nodded, consulted his clipboard, and began calling out names and farm assignments. Hoffmann, Meadowbrook Farm, 3 miles east. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, dairy and crops. A lorry arrived, not a military transport, but a civilian farm truck, its bed loaded with tools and supplies. The driver was a woman, perhaps 50, wearing practical clothes and Wellington boots. She regarded the 3 prisoners assigned to her farm with an expression Karl couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. Cautious. Measuring. "Right then," she said in English. Karl partially understood. "Climb in the back. Mind the tools." They drove through countryside that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to everything Karl had experienced since 1939. No bomb damage, no destroyed buildings, just green fields, stone farmhouses, sheep grazing on hillsides. The war felt distant here, almost unreal, though Karl knew British cities had been bombed and British soldiers had died fighting men like him. Meadowbrook Farm appeared around a bend, a stone farmhouse with a slate roof, several outbuildings, fields stretching in every direction. Mrs. Patterson parked in the yard where a man was repairing a fence. Her husband, presumably, gray-haired and lean, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd done physical work his entire life. He straightened as they approached, studied the 3 German prisoners with the same cautious measuring his wife had shown, then spoke to her in rapid English Karl couldn't follow. She responded, gesturing to the prisoners. Mr. Patterson nodded slowly, turned to them, and said in broken German, "Work. Good treatment. Bad work, no work. Understand?" Karl nodded. "Verstehen. Understand." "Right then." Mr. Patterson gestured toward the barn. "Milk cows first. Show you how." As they walked toward the dairy barn, Karl noticed Mrs. Patterson carrying something from the house, a tray with mugs. She called out, and Mr. Patterson stopped, turned back. She handed mugs to each prisoner. Tea, hot tea with milk and sugar, served in proper mugs, offered without ceremony, but without hostility either. Karl held the warm mug, staring at it, trying to understand. He was a German prisoner of war. Britain and Germany were still technically at war. The Patterson's son might be fighting in Germany at this very moment. Yet here they stood, offering tea to enemy soldiers who'd been sent to work on their farm. Mrs. Patterson noticed his confusion. She said something in English, saw he didn't understand, tried simpler words. Long day, work better with tea. That was all. No grand gesture, no dramatic forgiveness, just practical British logic. People work better when properly sustained, so you give them tea before starting work, even if those people were enemy prisoners. Carl drank the tea, tasting real milk and sugar for the first time in years, and began understanding that whatever he'd expected from working on a British farm, the reality was going to be more complicated than any propaganda had prepared him for. The system of agricultural labor. Britain's decision to employ German POWs in agricultural work was driven by necessity rather than sentiment. By 1944, Britain faced severe agricultural labor shortages. Over 500,000 farm workers had been conscripted for military service or diverted to war industries. Food production was critical. Britain depended on domestic agriculture, supplemented by dangerous Atlantic convoys bringing imports. Without adequate farm labor, crops would rot unharvested and food security would be threatened. German prisoners provided solution. Over 400,000 German and Italian POWs were held in British camps by 1945. Keeping them idle was wasteful when their labor could address critical shortages. The Geneva Conventions permitted employment of prisoners in agricultural work. The logic was straightforward: use available labor to maintain food production while British men fought overseas. The War Agricultural Executive Committees, War Ags, coordinated prisoner assignments to farms. Farmers could request POW labor, prisoners would be assigned for specific periods, work would be supervised but conducted with minimal military presence. The goal was making prisoners productive while maintaining security and ensuring proper treatment. The system required civilian cooperation. Farmers had to accept former enemy soldiers working on their land. Communities had to tolerate Germans living and working among them. This wasn't automatic. Many British civilians had lost family members to German actions, had endured the Blitz, had every reason to refuse cooperation with prisoners. But British practicality prevailed. Food production mattered more than grudges. If German labor could keep farms functioning, then German labor would be used. The decision wasn't about forgiveness, it was about getting work done. The first days, Carl Hoffman's first week at Meadowbrook Farm, established patterns that would define the next year of his captivity. Work began at 7 in the morning. The prisoners, Carl and 2 others, Heinrich and Wolfgang, would walk from their billet, a converted barn with cots, a stove, and basic furnishings, to the main farmhouse, where Mrs. Patterson would have tea and bread ready. Then Mr. Patterson would assign tasks for the day. The work was hard, but not impossible. Milking cows required learning technique Mr. Patterson demonstrated with patient repetition. Mucking out stalls was straightforward, if unpleasant. Repairing fences demanded attention, but wasn't complex. Feeding livestock involved following established routines. Mr. Patterson supervised, but didn't micromanage. He'd show them how to do something properly, expect competent execution, and correct mistakes without excessive criticism. His approach was matter of fact. This was work that needed doing. They were there to do it. No point making it more complicated than necessary. The language barrier created initial challenges. Mr. Patterson's German was limited to basic commands. The prisoner's English was minimal. Communication happened through demonstration, gestures, and gradually expanding vocabularies on both sides. By the end of the first week, they'd developed working pidgin adequate for daily tasks. What surprised Carl most was the absence of hatred. He'd expected British civilians to hate Germans, to treat prisoners with the minimum decency regulations required, but maximum hostility, personal feelings demanded. Instead, the Pattersons were simply correct. Not friendly, but not cruel. Professional in their dealings, maintaining appropriate distance while ensuring prisoners had what they needed to work effectively. Mrs. Patterson brought tea during morning and afternoon breaks. Not elaborate hospitality, but practical refreshment. Mr. Patterson ensured prisoners had adequate tools and explained tasks clearly. When Heinrich injured his hand on barbed wire, Mrs. Patterson cleaned and bandaged it with the same brisk competence she'd apply to any wound, not remarking on the irony of treating a German soldier's injury. The routine became comfortable through familiarity. Wake at 6, tea and bread. Work until noon. Brief lunch, usually bread, cheese, cold meat. Work until 5. Return to billet. Evening meal, provided by the farm. Letters home if desired, subject to censorship. Sleep, repeat. It was monotonous, but not unpleasant. After years of military service and combat, the predictability was almost restful. No one was shooting at them. Food was adequate. The work was honest. The Pattersons treated them like workers rather than criminals or enemies, maintaining standards that demanded competent performance while providing fair treatment in return. The village response. The presence of German POWs working on local farms created mixed reactions in Somerset villages. Some civilians were hostile. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd lost a son at Dunkirk, refused to acknowledge the Germans' existence. She'd cross the street rather than pass them on the pavement. Mr. Davies, whose house in Bristol had been destroyed during the Blitz, would mutter audibly about bloody Jerrys whenever he encountered prisoners. But most villagers adopted pragmatic acceptance. The Germans were here. They were working on farms that desperately needed labor, and they seemed to be behaving properly. Making a fuss about it served no useful purpose. Better to ignore them, or if interaction was necessary, maintain correct, if distant relations. The village pub initially refused to serve German prisoners. The landlord was adamant. This is a British pub for British people. Germans can drink somewhere else. But when Mr. Patterson pointed out that the prisoners weren't actually trying to drink there and were simply walking past on their way back from work, the landlord's righteousness deflated into embarrassed muttering about principles. The church presented different dynamics. Reverend Whitmore, an older man who'd been a chaplain in the Great War, announced that any person, including German prisoners, who wished to attend Sunday services was welcome. "The Lord's house is open to all," he said firmly when questioned. "These men are far from home, possibly frightened, certainly in need of spiritual comfort. I'll not turn anyone away from God's mercy, regardless of what uniform they wore." 3 prisoners attended Easter service in 1945. They sat in the back pew, didn't take communion, but sang hymns in German while the congregation sang in English. Some parishioners were uncomfortable. Others found it moving. Hearing "Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott," harmonizing with "A mighty fortress is our God," the same hymn in different languages, sung by former enemies in shared worship. Mrs. Patterson described the village response simply, "Most people were sensible about it. These lads were working hard, behaving properly, not causing trouble. Yes, they'd fought for the wrong side. Yes, some of us had lost people. But being nasty to prisoners working on farms wouldn't bring anyone back. Better to let them work, keep an eye on them, and get on with our own business." The loosening restrictions. As months passed and prisoners demonstrated reliability, restrictions gradually loosened in ways that would have shocked German military thinking about security. Initially, prisoners were escorted everywhere, from billet to farm, from farm to billet. A home guard volunteer would accompany them, rifle slung over shoulder, maintaining watch. But the home guard were mostly older men, with limited time, and supervising prisoners walking 3 miles to milk cows seemed increasingly absurd when those prisoners showed no inclination to escape. By summer 1945, after Germany's surrender, the escorts were discontinued. Prisoners walked unaccompanied to assigned farms, worked under farmer supervision, returned to billets on their own. The system relied entirely on prisoner cooperation. They could have walked away at any point. None did. "Where would we go?" Karl explained when asked about this years later. "Britain's an island. Germany was occupied in ruins, offering nothing to return to. We were being fed adequately, treated fairly, doing honest work. Escaping would mean giving up security and fair treatment for, what? Hiding in countryside until we were caught. It made no sense." Some farmers went further, inviting prisoners into their homes for meals. This was technically against regulations, but became common enough that authorities chose to ignore it. Mrs. Patterson started inviting the prisoners into the kitchen for Sunday dinner, a proper roast with vegetables, followed by pudding and tea. The first time this happened, Karl was stunned. "You invite us to your table?" he asked in halting English. Mrs. Patterson shrugged. "You work hard all week. Sunday dinner's proper meal. Seems mean, making you eat separately when there's room at our table." It was characteristic British logic, not based on emotion, but practical consideration. The prisoners worked hard. Sunday dinner was when proper meals happened. Excluding them from the table when they'd earned their place through honest work seemed pointlessly cruel. The conversations during these meals were limited by language barriers, but gradually became more comfortable. Mr. Patterson would discuss farming matters, weather, crops, livestock. Karl would describe farming in Germany, finding commonalities across national boundaries. Mrs. Patterson would serve food, correct their English pronunciation, and maintain the standards of proper table behavior, regardless of who sat at her table. The trust. The most remarkable aspect of prisoner employment on British farms was the trust that developed despite recent enmity. Mr. Patterson taught Karl to drive the farm tractor, a valuable skill and considerable responsibility. He showed Karl how to operate the machinery, what maintenance it required, and trusted him to use it properly without supervision. When the tractor broke down during plowing, Karl repaired it using skills learned from peacetime mechanical training. Mr. Patterson's response was a nod and good work, acknowledging competence without making it extraordinary. Wolfgang, who'd been a carpenter before the war, was given responsibility for major barn repair. Mr. Patterson provided materials and basic plans, then left Wolfgang to execute the work independently. The result was craftsmanship that exceeded what Mr. Patterson could have done himself. Precise joinery, careful finishing, professional quality construction. When Wolfgang finished, Mr. Patterson inspected it, nodded approval, and shook his hand. The first time he'd offered that gesture of respect. "They treated us like men," Karl reflected decades later. "Not like prisoners, not like enemies, but like workers whose competence they respected. Mr. Patterson trusted me with his tractor. His livelihood depended on that machine. Mrs. Patterson welcomed us into her home. That trust was more powerful than any guard or barbed wire could ever be. The trust was reciprocal. Prisoners began caring about farm success because they'd been given stake in it. When storms threatened harvest, prisoners worked extra hours voluntarily because they understood the consequences of losing crops. When Mr. Patterson injured his back, prisoners managed farm operations independently for 3 days, maintaining all routines without supervision. Because the farm's welfare had become something they cared about. This wasn't sentiment. It was the natural result of treating people with respect and trusting them to behave responsibly. The prisoners responded to fair treatment by becoming reliable workers who took pride in their competence. The Pattersons demonstrated that trust in defeated enemies wasn't weakness, but acknowledgement that circumstances, not character, had made them enemies. The conversations. As English improved and familiarity grew, deeper conversations became possible between prisoners and British civilians. One evening in autumn 1945, Carl and Mr. Patterson were repairing fence in the far field when Mr. Patterson asked directly, "Why'd you fight for Hitler?" Man was obviously mad. Carl paused, choosing words carefully in his improving English. "We were told different things, that Germany was treated unfairly after last war, that we were defending against threats, that we were making Germany strong again. Many lies. We believed because we were taught to believe." Mr. Patterson worked in silence for a moment, then said, "My brother fought in the last war, came home changed, never spoke about it. Germans then were told they were defending their country too, I expect. Soldiers believe what they're told to believe. Still wrong, mind you. Following bad orders doesn't make the orders good. But I suppose you've learned that now." "Yes," Carl said quietly. "I have learned this. Too late, but yes." These conversations, frank but not accusatory, acknowledging past wrongs while recognizing shared humanity, characterized the relationship that developed. The British didn't pretend German actions were acceptable. The prisoners didn't make excuses for the regime they'd served. But both sides acknowledged that individuals caught in war's machinery weren't necessarily evil, even if the cause they'd served had been. Mrs. Patterson once asked Carl if he had family. When he explained his wife and daughter lived in Hamburg, she nodded thoughtfully. "Must be difficult, being away from them, not knowing how they're managing." "Your son," Carl ventured, "he is in Germany now, with occupation forces?" "In Berlin," Mrs. Patterson confirmed, "Engineering Corps, helping rebuild what was destroyed. Writes that the Germans there are struggling, need everything. Strange world, isn't it? My son helping Germans rebuild while Germans help us harvest crops." "Strange," Carl agreed, "but perhaps good strange?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Patterson allowed. "Better than the alternative, certainly." The end of captivity. When prisoner repatriation began in 1946-47, many German POWs who'd worked on British farms faced complicated feelings about leaving. Germany offered little, cities in ruins, economy collapsed, society traumatized. Britain offered continued employment for those who chose to stay temporarily as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 former prisoners remained, continuing agricultural work while waiting for Germany to stabilize enough to make return practical. Carl chose to stay. His family's Hamburg apartment had been destroyed. His wife and daughter were living with relatives in the countryside, surviving but not thriving. British authorities offered him continued farm employment with civilian wages, actual money rather than prisoner stipend. He could save funds, send some home, eventually return to Germany with resources to help his family rebuild. Mr. Patterson made the offer directly. "You're welcome to stay on as hired man. Same work, proper wages, civilian status. You've proven yourself reliable. I'd rather keep someone I know works well than gamble on someone new." Carl accepted. The arrangement benefited both parties. Mr. Patterson retained experienced worker who knew the farm. Carl maintained employment and stability while Germany sorted itself out. The transition from prisoner to employee was marked by small changes with large symbolic weight. Carl moved from the converted barn to a proper cottage on the farm property. He received wages, could come and go freely, was treated as employee rather than prisoner. The work remained the same, but the context had transformed completely. The bonds that lasted. Some former prisoners who'd worked on British farms developed connections that lasted lifetimes. Karl Hoffmann remained at Meadowbrook Farm for 3 years before finally returning to Germany in 1949 with saved wages, letters of reference from the Pattersons, and conflicted feelings about leaving people who'd become something like friends. The Pattersons saw him off at the railway station with handshakes, a packed lunch for the journey, and Mrs. Patterson's eyes slightly damp, though she'd never admit to crying. They corresponded for decades. Karl would write describing his family's recovery, his work rebuilding Hamburg's infrastructure, his daughter's education. The Pattersons would write about farm news, village happenings, the slow return to normalcy in post-war Britain. The letters were never effusive. Both sides maintained British reserve, but they documented friendship built on mutual respect earned through shared work. When Karl's daughter married in 1965, she received a telegram from the Pattersons. Congratulations and best wishes for happy future. Patterson family, Meadowbrook Farm. Karl kept that telegram, framed it, displayed it in his home as evidence that former enemies could become friends through choosing fairness over hatred. Wolfgang, the carpenter, remained in Britain permanently. He married a British woman he'd met at church, settled in Somerset, raised children who grew up British but knew their German heritage. He maintained contact with other former prisoners who'd stayed, creating a small community of Germans who'd found unexpected homes in the country they'd fought against. In 1977, Mr. Patterson died at age 83. Karl traveled from Germany for the funeral, standing in the same church where he'd once sung German hymns during captivity, now singing English ones as mourner for a man who'd treated him with fairness when cruelty would have been understandable. Mrs. Patterson gripped his hand afterward. Father always said you were the best worker he'd ever hired. Thank you for coming all this way. The British way. The treatment of German POWs working on British farms exemplified the approach that characterized British conduct throughout the war. Restrained, practical, maintaining standards because standards defined who they were. The decision to employ prisoners on farms wasn't based on forgiveness or generosity. It was practical response to labor shortages. But the implementation reflected British values: fair treatment, firm discipline, maintained standards regardless of circumstances, trust extended when earned, and refusal to descend to enemy's level even when dealing with that enemy. This approach served multiple purposes. Practically, it maintained food production using available labor. Strategically, it demonstrated democratic civilization's superiority through actions rather than propaganda. Morally, it preserved British self-conception as people who maintained proper behavior even toward defeated enemies. For German prisoners who experienced this treatment, the impact was profound. They'd been taught that British were weak, decadent, corrupted by democracy. Instead, they encountered people whose strength came from principles, whose democracy functioned effectively under stress, whose civilization proved more durable than the 1,000-year Reich they'd fought for. Karl Hoffmann summarized it decades later. The British defeated us militarily, but they defeated us more completely by treating us fairly when they didn't have to. They showed us what civilization actually means, not the racial mysticism and power worship Nazis called civilization, but genuine respect for human dignity, even in enemies. That lesson, learned through being treated fairly on an English farm, taught me more about how societies should function than 12 years of Nazi education ever did.